In April 2009, a town in Italy was having many small tremors. So a meeting was held, and the seismologist said it was impossible to tell if a big quake was imminent. They said it was unlikely, but they couldn't rule it out. But town officials took this information and reassured residents there was nothing to worry about. Giustino Parisi's two children were awakened by a jolt in the middle of the night, but he put them back to bed because he had been reassured in a TV report that a big quake wasn't going to happen. They died hours later when the big quake actually hit. The scientists, the seismologists, were given 6-year jail terms for providing bad information. But here's the problem. The scientists did not give bad information. What they said was true. A big quake was unlikely, but they couldn't rule it out. So what can we learn from this? Be careful when explaining risks to the public. For example, antidepressants that inhibit serotonin reuptake are known to cause a small increase in the bleeding risk in people on anticoagulants. We'll discuss this later. It's a small increase, but it can be fatal in certain selected individuals. So we must be careful about how we talk to patients about this. We don't want to scare them too much, but we also don't want them to ignore the risk. It's a very delicate balance. Greetings, my name is Science-Hansten, and today we will discuss the nature of scientific knowledge. How do we know things in science? Sounds like a simple question, but it actually is a lot harder than it looks. So we're going to cover this in various parts. The first part is, how does scientific knowledge advance? Now, most people don't have a really good idea about this. Most people do not appreciate how science is really done. Some people think scientists exclaim, "Eureka!" when doing experiments, but actually they're more likely to say, and I won't read all those words because they're bad, but there are a lot of blind alleys and broken equipment and all sorts of things that happen along the way. You never see that in the published reports. What you see is all the successes, but there are a lot of failures that are along the way. And also, sometimes science advances through serendipity. Here's a case where my screw up, I'm the third author there, Farrow, Vaughan, and Hansten. My screw up was responsible for this paper. They should have put me first. We were studying, this is with Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, and we were studying the adenocarcinoma of the esophagus and why it was increasing while squamous cell carcinoma of the esophagus was not. So a certain kind of esophageal cancer was, was going up and another one wasn't. And I was the pharmacology consultant. They were for this series of studies on possible causes of esophageal and gastric cancer. They wanted to study H2 blockers, which they did, but that proved not to be profitable. In other words, they did not seem to cause esophageal cancer. But they asked me, as long as they're doing complete drug histories, did I want to study any other drugs in addition to the H2 blockers? So I suggested nonsteroidals, thinking they might cause irritation of the esophagus and increase cancer. But it turned out the data showed the opposite. Now, we didn't mention this in the final paper, that it was Phil's screw-up that generated this actually pretty interesting paper, where we were one of the first people to discover that these things, we already knew that these nonsteroidals and aspirin reduced colon cancer, but there was very little data on the upper GI tract. So this discovery occurred to my error, thinking that the nonsteroidals might do the opposite. Mum's the word. But when the dust settles, scientists generate a huge amount of information. So how does this deluge of scientific papers become scientific knowledge? Again, it sounds easy, but it's surprisingly difficult to answer that question. So is it like filling a pail? Do we keep pouring more and more knowledge into the pail until it's full and we know everything? Many people, especially the general public, think that it works pretty much like this. But let's analyze this a little bit. Okay, we have current knowledge in purple at the bottom, and the total of all possible knowledge is the whole column. So we add new discoveries, that increases our current knowledge. and more, and then pretty soon we fill the pail. It's the end of science. There are no new discoveries. Actually, this isn't how it works. Scientific advances lead to infinite ignorance. Of course, that's tongue in cheek, but it isn't like filling a pail. And here's the reason. We have knowledge, we have potential knowledge, things that we know we don't know. But when we have new discoveries, that leads to more knowledge, certainly, but it also increases our potential knowledge, what we know we don't know. So we're dumber than we were before. And this has happened with cytochrome P450 isozymes, which weren't a thing when I was at university, at UCSF. Same thing for ABC transporters. They were not a thing either. So all this came on after I graduated. And what they did, every time one of those new discoveries came out, there was a huge amount of information that we knew, or knowledge that we knew we didn't know yet. This is job security. This is job security for scientists, obviously. But here's the problem, or one of the problems. We don't use the knowledge we do have correctly. Most of the incentives are for discovering new in the field of drug interactions. Most of the incentives are for discovering new drug interactions and new molecular mechanisms, etc. This is intellectually stimulating, gets grant money, and I'm all for it. I mean, it's really, we need to keep doing that. But far less effort has been made to devise ways of using all of that information to prevent patient harm. And I would argue that we need more effort devising ways of using the drug interaction information that we already have. So it's not like filling a pail. Let's look at another metaphor that is used, the brick theory of scientific advances. Here's the idea that we have incontrovertible truths, and we just add new truths, new bricks, to the edifice of scientific knowledge. And this thing just keeps on building and building and gets higher and higher. Well, Harvard professor Louis Menand described why this doesn't work. People think knowledge develops by the accumulation of research findings, brick piled onto brick, until the arch of knowledge about a field stands clearly defined. Vast quantities of bricks are produced, but they are simply thrown into the heap. So this is what actually happens. It's not a nice brick wall, it's a heap of bricks. So let me give you an example. This is an adverse drug interaction. This man was on fluticasone, and the fluticasone was inhalational, started on itraconazole, an antifungal drug. After several weeks, he developed swollen face, lethargy, bruising, acne, and a buffalo hump. Laboratory results: high blood glucose, 0 serum cortisol, which is what you would expect in this circumstance, and a minimal response to the administration of ACTH. So we'll discuss that in class, why those laboratory results were the way they were. So basically, this is an example of the failure of the brick theory of scientific advances. Several corticosteroids are metabolized by 3A4 and interact with CYP3A4 inhibitors and increases their effect. This happens with inhaled and nasal corticosteroids because they can be absorbed enough so that they interact with 3A4 inhibitors. Cushing syndrome may occur with all sorts of bad side effects, and it can be actually life-threatening, especially in pediatric patients due to the adrenal insufficiency. So well documented. So I looked to see how well documented. Well, there are dozens of reports over a period of about 25 years. So here are all the bricks, each brick representing one paper describing this drug interaction. So then I thought, well, I'll check. A couple of years ago, I decided to check to see if there were any new reports, because I stopped looking here at 2020. Sure enough, there were several, and here's one from 2023. This person was on cobicostat, which is also a potent 3A4 inhibitor. This man was on cobicostat. He was diagnosed with asthma, started on budesonide, and then switched to fluticasone. Now, they both interact with cobicostat, so it wouldn't have mattered if he'd stayed on the budesonide or switched or whatever. 12 months later, muscle weakness, hypertension, moon face, buffalo hump, and striae on his abdomen, classic Cushing syndrome, and that's the diagnosis he got. So I checked again a couple of weeks ago. Yep, people are still rediscovering this drug interaction, even though it started to be reported 25 years ago. Every brick representing one report, sometimes with more than one person. In fact, in 2019, a case series of 35 patients from France who developed Cushing syndrome due to this drug-drug interaction. And keep in mind that published cases generally represent only a small fraction of all the cases that have occurred. If your error has just resulted in a severe adverse outcome, you usually don't announce it to the world by publishing a case report. So the vast majority of these cases never get published. Now notice that all of the cases involve 3A4 inhibitors that are given long term. In this case, cobicostat or ritonavir. And also, most of these cases involved inhaled corticosteroids. Notice at the bottom, though, there are 3 cases of interarticular triamcinolone. So even steroid injections into joints can be involved, but it's usually inhalational. And notice again, it usually takes a month or 2, sometimes longer, for this to occur. Occasionally, it only took a few weeks. So we could probably use a rule of thumb that we would start to be concerned if the CYP3A4 inhibitor is given for more than a couple weeks. Also notice that almost all the cases of Cushing syndrome were considered serious, so we should make every effort to prevent this drug-drug interaction from occurring. But that's not all. Here's a report of 23 more cases from the United Kingdom. Also, I believe, yes, also from 2019. And again, representing, I'm sure, a very small fraction of all the cases that occurred. Note it was mostly corticosteroid inhalers for asthma, but 7 of these were, at the bottom there, were triamcinolone joint injections. And 1 in the middle there was a steroid shampoo. I'm guessing that it was excessive use of the shampoo, but I'm not aware of other cases of topical use of steroids causing this. But so overall, we will probably get to close to 100 reported cases over the next few years. Basically, we're doing a horrible job of preventing the adverse outcomes from a known drug-drug interaction. So it could be inhalation, nasal spray, an injection into joints, maybe even topical. I suspect that one of the reasons why we're not doing a good job of preventing these is because with these products, at least with the triamcinolone into joints, we're thinking about local effects rather than systemic effects. So we may not be thinking enough about it. And it can be fatal. Excess fluticasone doses were involved in this case, where this 5-year-old girl died of adrenal insufficiency after inhaled fluticasone for 4 years. She was getting too much. But that's exactly what the drug interactions do. So theoretically, this same thing would apply to the drug interactions. Now, some people are fed up with this. This author, Williams, who was in one of those previous reports I cited from the UK, he's called for something to be done. He said cases of ritonavir-induced Cushing syndrome, it's not just ritonavir, by the way, and subsequent adrenocortical suppression were first reported in 1999. Despite awareness of this interaction, new cases continue to occur. Whoops. More innovative strategies to safeguard against these interactions are needed. Indeed, they are. And again, this is not a scientific problem. We know the science. This problem involves the philosophical concept of epistemic responsibility. We've mentioned that already, and we'll talk about it again in a couple of weeks. We have a responsibility to consider the empirical evidence and use rational thought as a guide to our action or inaction. So, what is our responsibility? How can we stop continuing carnage from this drug interaction? There could be roles for the pharmacist, physician, and other prescribers, health policy perhaps. Um, Maybe the pharmaceutical companies have some responsibility. But we'll discuss this in class. What can we do? How can we meet this responsibility? Okay, quick break. This is a blue-footed booby, and they're in the Galapagos, a wonderful place to visit. And their feet definitely were blue. Okay, here's another difficult question. Can science lead to certainty? Now, we already talked about this with regard to general certainty in all sorts of fields, not necessarily science. Now we want to focus on just the scientific aspects of it. Are there any situations where we can say that a particular theory or a scientific concept is known for sure? And the answer is not really. If it's a theory or concept, rather than just some trivial descriptive comment, there's always the possibility that it will be revised and improved with a slightly better theory. So, belief in scientific certainty became popular in the 1600s. So, what caused people to believe that scientific certainty was possible after 1665 to 1667? Well, we can blame this guy. Yes, Isaac Newton. With his scientific genius and amazing discoveries, he created the illusion that science would eventually come to know everything and we would be able to predict all future events. So, how about gravity? And we're going to come back to this, by the way. How about gravity? If you drop an apple, you can be pretty sure it's going to drop to the floor if there isn't anything stopping it. But that's just descriptive. It tells us nothing about the nature of gravity. And Newton was quick to admit that while he knew what gravity did, he did not know the actual nature of the gravitational force. It was pretty mysterious to him. And by the way, some people feel the apple story is apocryphal, and the fact that it fell on his head, or the statement that it fell on his head, probably is apocryphal, but he did tell people later that he saw an apple fall and started to think in earnest about gravity after that, albeit not a bonk on the noggin. Is gravity certain? Even your cat knows that. Why do they push things off tables just to see them fall? We don't have pets now, but when we had cats, they considered anything close to the edge of a table to be fair game. Never coffee, however. They drew the line at that kind of thing. So Isaac Newton was born in this building in 1643. This is Woolsthorpe Manor in the hamlet in the county of Lincolnshire. And this is where he returned in 1665, so about 20 years later, and spent the next 2 years making scientific discoveries that would shake the world. Here's his apple tree, still alive after 400 years, sort of. It blew down in the early 1800s and lost a bunch of branches, but they rerouted it, and it apparently survived. And there are cuttings of this tree all over the world, including, I'm told, at UW in front of the chemistry building. So I haven't physically seen it, but it probably is still there. So belief in scientific certainty lasted from Isaac Newton until the very early 1900s, and you probably know what happened then. Einstein's relativity showed that Newton's discoveries were not 100% correct under all circumstances, and as a result, Einstein, that plus other things, he fundamentally changed the scientific world. So Einstein destroyed the fallacy of scientific certainty. And Eddington showed that Einstein was right. The gravity of the sun actually did bend light rays coming from a distant star. So his theory, and because Einstein's theory could have been refuted by Eddington's 1919 eclipse experiment, Karl Popper, a philosopher of science, concluded that this is what made the scientific theory scientific, his theory of relativity. This was Karl Popper's falsifiability test. If a theory cannot be falsified, it's not science. So Einstein destroyed the fallacy of certainty, and Popper helped. Popper and Einstein, between them, did more than anyone else to destroy a view of the nature of science that it was almost universally held at the beginning of the 20th century. The view that scientific knowledge is built up on the basis of direct observations and experience, and that is what makes it special. And that what makes it special is its incorrigible certainty. He also said, all our science measured against reality is primitive and childlike, and yet it's the most precious thing we have. I'm sure he would have agreed that the love of a mother for a baby is more precious, but he was talking mainly about science. I forgot to silence my phone. Sorry about that. Okay, another eminent scientist. This is physicist Edward Teller, who said something similar. If there ever was a misnomer, it's exact science. Science has always been full of mistakes, and the present day is no exception. Now, Teller had to use a weed whacker to trim his eyebrows, and he is known as the father of the hydrogen bomb, which I don't think he was that happy about later on. And also, just an interesting tidbit about Teller. In 1957, he warned at meetings about the carbon dioxide and the greenhouse effect causing global warming. So we've known about this for a very long time. They ignored him then, just as they're ignoring many climatologists now. And Teller was one of the 9. Here's an interesting book, which I really enjoyed reading. The Great Escape, 9 Jews Who Escaped Hitler and Changed the World by Katie Martin. And it's not just Teller, but a whole bunch of other people, brilliant scientists and writers and photographers and film. Leo Szilard, Eugene Wigner, John von Neumann, Arthur Kessler, brilliant guy. Michael Curtis, film director, Robert Capa, photographer, and several more. So, here's Popper again, and this is a very important concept. Yes, this is the first thesis. He has a second one too, but we know a great deal, and we know not only many details of doubtful intellectual interest, but also things which are of considerable practical significance, and what is even more important, which provide us with deep theoretical insight and with a surprising understanding of the world. I don't see how anybody could argue against this first thesis. It's pretty close to being self-evident. But too many people stop there. They focus on that, and then they say, okay, that's it. What they should do is also embrace the second. You got to embrace them both. Second thesis is, our ignorance is sobering and boundless. Indeed, it is precisely the staggering progress in the natural sciences which constantly opens our eyes anew to our ignorance. This is what we've been talking about. With each step forward and with each problem which we solve, we not only discover new and unsolved problems, but we also discover that where we believed that we were standing on firm and safe ground, all things are in truth insecure and in a state of flux. So this is a state of science that most people don't think about, or sometimes at all. Now, the problem is people that focus too much on the first and ignore the second, but there are also people who focus only on the problems in science and ignore the first. You have to, I think, in my opinion, you have to endorse both of these statements and hold them together as a unified whole. Another real quick break. When we lived on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington State, we got visits from the local otters, river otters, not the kind that you see in the ocean, not sea otters. And this guy came up and took a little snooze on our deck. I took a picture of it and sent it into the Seattle Times, and they said, we'd love to publish this, but is he dead? So I had to send him another photo showing that no, when he was done with his nap, he was very much alive. So then they went ahead and published it. can't, I was a little insulted that they thought I would send a picture of a dead otter to them to put in the paper. Okay, here's another problem we have with science. Language also limits our ability to claim absolute certainty in science. How can something as imperfect as language accurately represent reality? This is something that a lot of people don't think about, but it's a serious problem. Now, the poet Rumi thought about this. He had a great take on this. He said, language is like a tailor shop where nothing fits. And by the way, I'm sure some of you are Rumi fans. I read that he is the best-selling poet in the U.S., and I've contributed to that. I have a couple of his, this one's a bunch of his poems, and this one is the Illuminated Rumi. Great stuff. He's a great poet, was a great poet. Okay, but back to the point of the limitations of language. How would you describe the precise folds and shadows in this towel so that someone who can't see it would have an accurate picture? Obviously, there's absolutely no way you could do that, except very generally. I mean, I couldn't even tell you what color this towel is, let alone how all those folds exist in that towel. I probably know only 6 or 8 colors. The 20 different types of purple, for example, are a complete mystery to me. I have no clue what they are. And of course, there's the ultimate question, do we even know we exist? Descartes proposed this idea, and then he said he didn't believe it, he proposed this ingenious argument that since we sometimes have very realistic dreams, why couldn't reality just be a dream that is just way more realistic than a regular dream? Blaise Pascal, his fellow Frenchman of around the same time, said something very similar to that. But then, of course, he went on to say his famous "I think, therefore I am," which where he dismissed this idea. But was Descartes onto something here? This guy, Nick Bostrom, which some of you heard about, he has degrees in philosophy, mathematics, logic, artificial intelligence from the University of Gothenburg. And by the way, my wife and I spent some time in Gothenburg, of all places. And the first night we were there, the next morning at breakfast, I said, well, we pronounce your city Gothenburg to the Swedish waiter. How do you pronounce it? And he said something like Göteborg. So we say Gothenburg and they say Göteborg. Where do we get off changing the name of their city? That's always been a mystery to me. He then got a master's degree in computational neuroscience, physics, and philosophy, then a PhD in philosophy from the London School. So kind of an overachiever. And a couple of decades ago, he came up with an interesting observation. He says there's a real chance we are living in a simulation created by superintelligent AI. And he came up with 3, and some of you know much more about this than I do. I'm just saying that this is something that's been proposed. Advanced beings, there's 3 possibilities, and he says only 3 possibilities. Advanced beings almost always go extinct before they develop the ability to create simulations. This is the most chilling of the possibilities, but I think there's a chance that it's actually the truth, or that this is actually the case. The second one is, even if they achieve the ability to create simulations, they aren't interested in developing them. That seems fairly unlikely. The first one seems, to me, I know nothing about this, but the first one seems more likely to me than the second. And then, if 1 and 2 are false, which they could both be false, then the probability that we're living in a simulation is close to 1.0. And as you recall, a probability of 1.0 means certainty. Now, many, many people, since Bostrom proposed this 20 years ago, a huge number of people have weighed in on this, all sorts of computer scientists and physicists and philosophers and everybody else. One person recently said he thinks it's about 50-50. Gauging whether or not we dwell inside someone else's computer may come down to advanced AI research or measurements at the frontier of cosmology. Some people think it's it's virtually certain that, that we are pretty almost certainly in a simulation. But anyway, whether or not this makes any sense to you or not, there are those kinds of things that always come up. Okay, facts versus probabilities. This is a really important concept. People love to talk about facts. The fact is blah, blah, blah. But most statements people make on public policy or even scientific statements should be stated as probabilities. Even something like climate change is a probability, albeit an extremely high probability that it's a problem, but it's not 1.0. But it's probable enough so that we should be doing something about it, obviously. And Nietzsche knew this. He said, strictly speaking, we are never able to speak of truth, but only probability and degrees of probability. This is something we always have to keep in mind. And again, as I mentioned, not just science, but every other field. This is a painting of Nietzsche, by the way, by the Norwegian Edvard Munch, the same guy who did The Scream. So if you look at scientific theories, they would range from absolute certainty the theory is false to absolute certainty this theory is true. Now, there are some that are pretty close to either end. And for those, we have a practical certainty that it's false on the left there, and a practical certainty that it's true on the right. Not absolute certainty, but something you can pretty much assume to be the case. And if you look at a whole bunch of different theories, they line up all over the place on this spectrum. The likelihood of a theory at the right end of the spectrum being completely overturned is really very small. Except for the one at the upper right there. The best rock song of all time is I Love Rock and Roll by Joan Jett. That one is close to 1.0, but some of the others might be overturned, but it's very, very unlikely. And when I talk about right over the very there, life exists on other planets, I'm talking about not intelligent life, just any life. Intelligent life doesn't even exist on our planet, so you can hardly expect it to exist elsewhere. And then, going down, I won't go through all of these, but there are a number of theories of varying degrees of certainty. Now, the reason why that the ones at the far right are very unlikely to be completely overturned, they will certainly be tweaked and adjusted, but is this. Well-established scientific theories are supported by many strands of evidence, often from several different disciplines, and that's important. Many times it's 4 or 5 different disciplines that have all focused on it from a different standpoint, and they all came to the same conclusion. Like Gulliver, if you remove 2 or 3 of these strands, it does not change the situation. In science, individual strands may be removed because they prove to be false, but they're often replaced by even stronger ropes that fit even better into the overall theory. So that's one way to think about really well-established theories, that if you find some little problem with one aspect of them, that's very unlikely to unhinge the entire theory. Now, epidemiologic theories are a little different. If all we have are epidemiology or epidemiologic studies to support something, we rarely get past probable. If there's enough of them, like smoking and cancer, yeah, okay, you can have just epidemiology and come to an established connection. But many of the connections derived from epidemiologic studies never get past probable. Now, with drug interactions, epidemiological studies on the existence of a drug interaction fall into that category. They very rarely can conclusively state that a drug interaction occurs. But, and this is important, once a drug interaction has been established by other evidence, pharmacokinetic studies, case reports, strong biological plausibility, that sort of thing, then once we know the interaction occurs, then epidemiological studies are very valuable in seeing how often a known drug interaction causes adverse effects. So epidemiological studies are great for looking at how often a known interaction causes problems. A lot more difficult to establish the existence of a drug interaction, if you see what I'm getting at there. And for example, the one on the right here, the clarithromycin causing digoxin toxicity, we already knew that drugs interacted from case reports and kinetic studies, et cetera. So the epi studies were just done, in this case by David Yerlink, who's a pharmacist, physician, PhD in epidemiology, who does great work on the epidemiology of drug interactions. He looked at how often it caused problems, not whether it existed. So the problem why we usually don't get beyond probable is association and causation. Here's a correlation. The number of people who drowned by falling into a pool correlates with films Nicolas Cage appeared in. These are done by Tyler Vigen. He has a number of these that are quite amusing. Tyler Vigen also figured out that a number of people who died by becoming tangled in their bed sheets correlates with per capita cheese consumption. So you have to be careful with correlations. They may or may not represent causation in these epidemiological studies. So, probabilities, not facts. Virtually every statement we make is a statement of probability rather than a statement of fact. Now, some things are very obviously probabilistic, like whether the Huskies will win their next game. That's just a probability. But in some of the most important areas of our lives, we are dealing with probabilities: economics, sociology, psychology, financial markets, public policies of all types. Yet almost, in politics too, of course, especially politics, yet almost all politicians of any stripe claim to speak in facts and certainties rather than probabilities. And even in science, we're dealing with probabilities, albeit sometimes so close to certain that we can assume that it's a fact, but it's still, we have to keep in the back of our mind, it's a probability. This is Douglas Lake up in British Columbia. I was there one fall. It was just a gorgeous day, not a breath of wind, and a beautiful blue sky. Okay, we're on the home stretch here. Now let's talk about paradigm shifts. Here's the guy that coined the term, Thomas Kuhn. He said we have normal science, and when we're doing normal science, and this is what most science is normal science, where you're just, putting along, discovering things here and there. But what can happen sometimes, not always, but sometimes anomalies start to accumulate. Things that don't fit with our theories, the theories that we had assumed. And eventually, if enough of these anomalies first, when the anomalies first occur, we think, well, we didn't do the experiment correctly, or it's just an outlier or whatever. So we explain them away for a while. But if they get to the point where we can't explain them away, we end up with a paradigm shift where the particular science, whatever it is in question, gets an earthquake, a huge shift in what's going on in their field. So what are the implications of this? Well, normal science is important, but it's just puzzle solving. And also from this, Kuhn pointed out that science is not purely objective. It's a social activity affected by peer pressure, bias, envy, ambition, greed, sloth, confirmation bias, all sorts of things. And it's theory-laden. It's contaminated by the theoretical assumptions of the paradigm. And sometimes it's hard to break out of that theory-ladenness to actually have a paradigm shift, especially the people that have spent their entire lives in one paradigm. They may fight kicking and screaming not to adopt the new one. Here's an example: discovery of Neptune. When there were anomalies in the movement of the planets, they said, gee, there's got to be something out there. And sure enough, that's Neptune's the one in blue on the far right. Sure enough, it was there. So sometimes these anomalies lead to new discoveries. And the paradigm shift, the way Thomas Kuhn describes it, is kind of like a Gestalt switch that occurs. This, of course, you've all seen this a million times. This could be a duck or a rabbit, depending on how you look at it. And I can go back and forth. I'm doing it right now. Now it's a duck. Now it's a rabbit. But people see things in a new way. So after the paradigm shift, the duck is no longer in existence and everybody sees a rabbit. Same thing, do you see bumps or craters? They're actually craters. If you think about it for a second, it's got to be craters. And then last one is methodological fetishism. This is a surprisingly common source of problems. And okay, let's explain what we mean by this. The parachute principle is an example. This was an article that came out in 2003. Parachute use to prevent death and major trauma related to gravitational challenge. Systematic review of randomized controlled trials. And this was published in 2003. And their conclusion was there are no randomized double-blind studies on the efficacy of using parachutes to prevent death after jumping out of an airplane. So the evidence is anecdotal, which is the lowest form of evidence. So the efficacy of parachutes has not been subjected to rigorous controlled trials and cannot be considered established. So now obviously this was all tongue-in-cheek. try to get a serious point across that we have to be careful about having this fetish for double-blind controlled, randomized double-blind controlled studies as being the only way you can get information. Now, this same argument could be made for theoretical drug-drug interactions, such as the use of, let's say there's a new drug that came out. It's a strong inhibitor of CYP3A4 and also P-glycoprotein. Now, you have about a 99% chance that if it's a strong inhibitor of both that enzyme and that transporter, it's going to interact in a major way with colchicine, vincristine, and several other drugs that are substrates for those two things. So even though there are no studies, you don't need to have any studies actually to alter your prescribing practices, because it's pretty likely it's going to get people into trouble. Now, so that's the parachute principle. And finally, 15 years later, somebody finally did a controlled trial. It was a randomized controlled study of 23 healthy subjects. So just exactly what you needed. The subjects were randomized to either a parachute or an empty backpack and then jumped from an aircraft. Upon impact with the ground, subjects were checked for death. And surprisingly, parachute use did not reduce death when jumping from an aircraft. Now, here's the reason. The plane, for controls and backpack or parachute, the plane was sitting on the ground and it was a nice soft grass that they jumped onto. So it clever, but it certainly showed that jumping out of an aircraft doesn't necessarily result in death without a parachute. But this same methodological fetishism was a term coined by the Naomi Oreskes, Harvard professor you see at the bottom. We're going to discuss her book in class next time. And she gives examples of dental floss, N95 masks, how people have this idea that if you don't have extensive randomized double-blind controlled studies, that you can't accept any other information, and that the use of dental floss and N95 masks are both worthless. Of course, it's not true, but that's what many people, or not many, but at least some prominent people have pointed that out, that we don't have the good studies, so we can assume it's not true. I'm just adding that adverse drug effects because that is another area where sometimes people don't believe it because they feel you're not dealing with double-blind randomized controlled studies. And with adverse drug effects, we often aren't. Okay, here's the last one. Information versus knowledge versus wisdom. Historically, we felt that information and knowledge were enough. So just looking at from a drug interaction standpoint, information would be the information published in journals, registries, etc. about drug interactions. Then knowledge would be people that gather all that stuff together and they publish monographs and clinical decision support and books and various other things where they've evaluated the information and gotten into the next level, which is knowledge, which is a lot more usable. But the problem is, frequently they stop there, and we don't spend nearly enough time taking that drug interaction knowledge and apply it with nuance and wisdom for patient care. So, William Cooper, it's pronounced Cooper, I'm told. I use this quote so often in giving lectures on drug interactions for a couple of decades that I accidentally committed it to memory. I think it's one of the best things anybody ever said. Knowledge and wisdom, far from being one, have oftentimes no connection. Knowledge dwells in heads replete with the thoughts of other men, wisdom in minds attentive to their own. And I'm sorry about the men thing, but that was, a couple hundred years ago. Knowledge, a rude, unprofitable mass, the mere materials with which wisdom builds, till smoothed and squared and fitted to its place, does but encumber whom it seems to enrich. And the reason why I showed this, in drug interaction studies is all of that information, that rude, unprofitable mass of information that comes out of computers to warn health professionals about drug interactions. So, information and knowledge for drug interactions is overwhelming, and we need more wisdom to figure out how to deal with the glut. And by the way, here's the Cowper's poems. There we go. So when I wrote my first drug interaction book in 1970, there were only a few hundred papers on drug interactions. That's this book here. And only about this much of the book was devoted to drug interactions, the rest less than that. So I can remember every paper that was published because there were only a few hundred of them. By 2014, 10 years ago, that number was probably 40,000. And that's when John Horn and I decided to stop publishing our comprehensive book, which was this one here. And it was pretty fat, about 2,000, these are very thin pages, so about 2,000 pages of, and at that point we said, two people can't handle this anymore, so we stopped. Now I suspect we're probably getting close to 100,000 drug interaction papers. So completely impossible for any one individual to put all that in their brain. And this knowledge versus wisdom thing, Neil Postman, who was a professor at New York University, a prolific writer, and especially a cultural critic, he said, one can have a great deal of knowledge about the world but entirely lack wisdom. That is frequently the case with scientists, politicians, entrepreneurs, academics, and even theologians. So he recognized that we have a problem of a lot of knowledge and very little wisdom. So don't forget, science does not advance by filling a pail or by bricks in a wall, and new knowledge creates new questions. Scientific theories are not absolutely certain. In principle, they can always be improved. Scientific facts are really probabilities. Paradigm shifts in science are rare, but they can revolutionize a particular discipline. Let me just pause here for a second and point out that in the field of drug interactions, we've had major advances, like with the cytochrome P450 enzymes, et cetera. But that didn't throw out the old stuff. That just refined the old stuff and explained what we were seeing with the old stuff. So we really haven't had a true paradigm shift in drug interactions since I started studying it in 1966. So we need to avoid methodological fetishism and consider all available evidence, no matter where it comes from. And finally, knowledge without wisdom can lead to bad decisions and sometimes disasters. So that concludes the nature of scientific knowledge. How do we know things in science? Thank you very much for your attention.